Welcome back to our continuing study of the life of Christ. Hello, I'm Jonathan Bennett, Associate Minister with the Central Church of Christ, located at 90 Waverly Court, Martinsburg, West Virginia. We invite you to visit the congregation's website, ccocwv.org, to learn more about the congregation meeting in Martinsburg. In this time of study together, we're going to be looking at lesson number 45 in the study of the life of Christ. The title of this lesson is Herod Notices Jesus and the Apostles Return. It is taken from Matthew chapter 14, verses 1 through 13, Mark chapter 6, verses 14 to 32, Luke chapter 9, verses 7 through 10, and John chapter 6, verse 1. If you're following along in the Truth for Today commentaries, it'll be pages 429 to 436 in volume 1 of the study on the life of Christ. Just as a reminder, this study was originally produced by Truth for Today and is being graciously allowed for the congregation at Martinsburg to use in both live stream and podcast format. In our last lesson together, we talked about Jesus sending out the 12 in groups of 2, also Jesus going and ministering in Galilee. Well, in this distribution of the apostles and Jesus himself going out and preaching, the tour Galilee made Jesus' name well known to Herod Antipas, who was the ruler of Galilee. So let's keep this in mind, and if you're following along in your Bible and able to, I encourage you to turn to Mark chapter 6, going to begin in verse 14. And read down to verse 32, and then we'll come back and take a look at the lesson. Matthew chapter 6, beginning at 14th verse. Now King Herod heard of him, that is, heard of Jesus, for his name had become well known. And he said, John the Baptist is risen from the dead, and therefore these powers are at work in him. Others said, it is Elijah. Others said, it is the prophet, or like one of the prophets. But when Herod heard, he said, this is John, whom I beheaded. He has been raised from the dead. For Herod himself had sent and laid hold of John, and bound him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, for he had married her. Because John had said to Herod, it is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. Therefore Herodias held it against him and wanted to kill him, but she could not. For Herod feared John, knowing that he was a just and holy man, and he protected him. And when he heard him, he did many things and heard him gladly. Then an opportune day came when Herod on his birthday gave a feast for his nobles, the high officers and the chief men of Galilee. And when Herodias' daughter herself came in and danced and pleased Herod and those who sat with them, the king said to the girl, ask me whatever you want, and I will give it to you. He also swore to her, whatever you ask me, I will give it to you, up to half of my kingdom. So she went out and said to her mother, what shall I ask? And she said, the head of John the Baptist. Immediately she came in with haste to the king and asked, saying, I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter. And the king was exceedingly sorry, yet because of the oaths and because of those who sat with him, he did not want to refuse her. Immediately the king sent an executioner and commanded his head to be brought. And he went and beheaded him in prison, and brought his head on a platter and gave it to the girl. The girl gave it to her mother. When his disciples heard of it, they came and took away his corpse. and laid it in a tomb. Then the apostles gathered to Jesus and told him all things, both of what they had done and what they had taught. And he said to them, "Come aside by yourselves to a deserted place and rest a while, for there were many going and coming, and they did not even have time to eat." So they departed to a deserted place in the boat by themselves. Now, as we come back here, let's back up and come back to the beginning of Mark chapter 6, in that 14th verse. And notice there in verses 14 to 16 how it reads. Now King Herod heard of him, that is talking about Jesus, for his name had become well known. He said, "John the Baptist is risen from the dead, and therefore these powers are at work in him." Others said, "It is Elijah." Others said, "It is the prophet," or like one of the prophets. But when Herod heard, he said, "This is John, whom I beheaded. He has been raised from the dead." Now, let's think about this. Let's think about this here. Herod takes notice of Jesus. And notice Herod's indifference toward Jesus. Apparently, if you had been one of these peasant reformer, or you were someone who really wasn't, causing a major stir, you just, well, they're doing that. They're not going to get a big following. It did not warrant a response from the king. It didn't warrant his attention. It did not require him to perk his head up. And it was because, as long as they did not stir up the masses in a rebellion. And this is the way it worked. Kings did not pay attention to those who would try to. They'd be like, well, they're just a minor sect. If they want to live off by themselves, let them go. Let them be. But think about this. Jesus is here now, and he sent out the apostles 2 by 2. And he himself goes out. Now, if you send them out 2 by 2, that's a group. That's 6 different groups. Like say, if it's per se 6 teams, and now you have Jesus going out. So there are 7 teams crisscrossing Herod's territory, thus rendering him at this way, coming to a point where he says, and making him realize, I can't ignore this threat. I can't just ignore this. It's not like just 1 or 2 people or this small group going here and following one path, and it's one content, and I can follow where it's at. No, he's looking at it and saying, wait a minute. There are 7 different areas being taught the same thing. What's going on? Is there an uprising? Is it an enemy? Are they enemy combatants? Who are they? What are they doing? And what are they teaching? What are they trying to do to the masses? And what kind of threat is it posing to me? So it brings us down here to Herod's thoughts on who Jesus was. He thought it was John the Baptist. Herod himself thinks it's John the Baptist who was raised from the dead. But as we see here in verse 15, some are saying where Jesus was Elijah. Some are saying some other prophet that had been raised from the dead. Some were saying the prophet. Again, some were in agreement with Herod that Jesus was John the Baptist who had been raised from the dead. But this here shows the ignorance of those who were living at the time. John and Jesus had overlapping ministries. Think about this. Overlapping ministries, and people were too ignorant to take note of that. They were too ignorant to use the cognitive ability to make a discernment, to come to a logical conclusion. It could not be him, because John and this man both had been teaching at the same time. And as is pointed out in the Truth for Today commentary, and also in the outline that was produced to help with this lesson, Ignorance has never hindered men in their speculation. Men have always made speculations, regardless of whether they know the absolute truth or not about a situation. Speculation will always be made. Think about that. Ignorance has never hindered men in making speculations. And that's what we have to remind ourselves of, even in 21st century society and culture. When we make speculation about something, we need to be educated. Make ourselves knowledgeable about what's going on before we speak on the matter. It's better to be silent and appear to be intelligent than to open our mouths and let our ignorance show. But think about this. Here's Herod. What happens here? He makes a decision to seek out Jesus. He wanted to see Jesus for himself. Now, let's back up here for just a moment. Let's back up here to talking about when we first started this, about Herod's indifference toward Jesus. Why is it so important for him to take note of him? Was it not Herod's ancestors who was it not Herod's family who was in control when Jesus was born? Was it not Herod's family, the one who was in control when Jesus was born, and they wanted to come after him? Why? They wanted to know. They wanted everything could to come up on him. So now Herod Antipas wants to see Jesus for himself, so he could determine why. If it was Jesus, it could determine if Jesus was or was not actually John the Baptist. You can see it over in Luke chapter 9 and verse 9. Luke chapter 9 and verse 9, we read there, Herod said, John I have beheaded, but who is this of whom I hear such things? So Herod sought to see him, that is, to see Jesus. With Herod's abundant resources, typically one with such a public presence, like Jesus had, would not have been hard or difficult to find. But think about this. Jesus would elude Herod's grasp. Why? It wasn't Jesus' time. What would have happened if Herod would have got a hold of him? And more than likely, would have imprisoned him. Excuse me. But Herod continued to want to see Jesus. Luke chapter 23 and verse 8. We see the account on the night before Jesus' death. We read of Jesus being brought before Herod, who, quote, had wanted to see him for a long time because he had been hearing about him, was hoping to see some sign performed by him. Again, that's Luke chapter 23 and verse 8. Before Jesus was crucified, he did come before Herod Antipas. And think about this. I want everyone who is being a part of this study to think about this. That if Herod had judged Jesus to be a threat, he most certainly would have ordered Jesus' death there on the spot. But did he? No. Over in Luke chapter 13, if you turn over there with me, verses 31 to 33. On that very day, some Pharisees came, saying to Jesus, "Get out and depart from here, for Herod wants to kill you." Jesus said to them, "Go tell that fox, behold, I cast out demons and perform cures today and tomorrow, and the third day I shall be perfected. Nevertheless, I must journey today, tomorrow, and the day following, for it cannot be that a prophet should perish outside of Jerusalem." So again, we go back to this, and you think about how Herod the Great, that is Herod Antipas' dad, reacted when he heard the birth of Jesus back in Matthew chapter 2, verse 16. He wanted, what did Herod the Great do when Jesus Christ was born of a virgin? Sought out to get rid of him, to eliminate him, to just totally get rid of a threat or a perceived threat. We have to keep these things in mind. So Herod Antipas seeking Jesus out. But even the night before Jesus was crucified upon that cruel Roman cross, Herod did not order the death of Jesus. Now we can go back to Mark chapter 6. We're going to pick up in verse 17. Let's read this again, beginning in the 17th verse. For Herod himself had sent and laid hold of John, and bound him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, for he had married her. Because John had said to Herod, "It is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife." Therefore Herodias held it against him and wanted to kill him, but she could not. For Herod feared John, knowing that he was a just and holy man, and he protected him. And when he heard him, he did many things, and heard him gladly. Then an opportune day came when Herod, on his birthday, gave a feast for his nobles, the high officers, and the chief men of Galilee. And when Herodias' daughter herself came in and danced, and pleased Herod and those who sat with him, the king had said to the girl, "Ask me whatever you want, and I will give it to you." He also swore to her, "Whatever you ask me, I will give it you, up to half of my kingdom." So she went out and said to her mother, "What shall I ask?" And she said, "The head of John the Baptist." Immediately she came in with haste to the king and asked, saying, "I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter." And the king was exceedingly sorry, yet because of the oaths and because of those who sat with him, he did not immediately refuse her. Immediately the king sent an executioner and commanded his head to be brought. And he went and beheaded him in prison, brought his head on a platter, and gave it to the girl, and the girl gave it to her mother. When his disciples heard of it, they came and took away his corpse and laid it in a tomb. Now think about this. Herod Antipas had taken his half-brother Philip's wife, Herodias, as his own. Now think about the situation. That John had spoken plainly about the immorality of the situation. Herod had arrested John because of his speaking out. John told him, "You can't do this. This isn't right. This isn't moral. This isn't ethical." And even though Herod had arrested John, he still feared him. He knew John was righteous and he was a righteous and holy man. Plus, he enjoyed listening to John, so he allowed John to live. He was also fearful that the death of one considered by many to be a prophet might result in an uprising. You look back at Matthew chapter 14, verse 5. So think about this and what has just been said here, and this portion that we're opening up, if you will. Herod Antipas has his half-brother Philip's wife, and it would be his, and we read about this. So as we look at this, think of it. So he has his brother's wife, and now we come down here on Herod's birthday. Herodias seizes an opportunity with the help of her daughter, who would be Herod's niece. Now think about this. It says her daughter. This is Herod's niece comes in and dances to the delight of Herod and his guests. Now, let's stop right here and think about what is taking place at this point in history. Let's stop and think about the ramifications that are coming out of this. What's going on within this whole realm of this this party, if you will. It's a birthday party. So when we look at this, it says that she came before them and danced. And it's to the delight of Herod and his guests. More than likely, this is more than just what we think of as a birthday party or get together in our current culture and society. It's just not coming together and have a backyard barbecue with some birthday cake. This is more than likely a drunken orgy with a lot of sexual promiscuity happening, lots of fornication and adultery, and incest. At this point, it's what we're seeing. What's being alluded to here, pay attention to the text as we read this. This is Herod's niece coming in and is dancing provocatively before him and before his guest, and is giving them great satisfaction. Now, we're not talking about dancing with the stars, of getting a card held up with a 8.5 to 10 or whatever however they score them now, or like the Olympics. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about this young lady comes in, is putting on a sexually provocative display. It is so pleasing to her uncle, who is the king, that Herod made a promise to this girl to give her whatever she asked for, up to half of his kingdom. The Bible tells us she's dancing before him, but it doesn't go into any more detail. What else is going on around here? Now, I'm not asking anyone to even begin to envision immorality in their minds, but we can only imagine the things that would have the potential of happening here. So when Herod looks at his niece, who has just given him this gratification and made him very physically and physiologically pleased, he tells her he'll give her anything, up to half of the kingdom. She runs out, which more than likely her and her mother have already schemed this together, but to make things look good before everybody present, she runs out and asks her mother, "What should I ask for?" Well, more than likely they've already got it planned out. She goes out and asks the head of Herod, or I'm sorry, the head of John the Baptist. She runs back in and tells him Herod has no choice but to fulfill her request because of the oaths he had made and because of who the guests were in attendance. Now think about this. What lessons can we learn from the text here? Well, what about speaking out against immorality? Even at a great cost to yourself. John the Baptist had from the beginning, and the whole reason for his incarceration at this point was because he had spoken out against Herod having his brother's wife. Well, that's number one. Well, number two here, now let's think about this. So he's spoken out against the immorality. Herod loves to hear John talk about it, but doesn't stop him from seeing his niece dancing provocatively in front of him, giving him sexual gratification in some form, which causes what? Causes him to make some rash promises. Well, he made some rash decisions, which caused him to be very sorry in the long run because he respected and feared John the Baptist, but he had already made this. Thus, he had to, quote unquote, save face in front of all those who were in attendance and kill John the Baptist for something he had never done. Besides, tell him, what you're doing is immoral and ungodly. Saving face in front of other people. So what can we learn? Well, number one, to never let ourselves be under the influence of something that changes how we think as a human, and also for those who are New Testament Christians, how we think as Christians, that under the influence of alcohol or illicit drugs, or under the influence of allowing ourselves to become involved in sexual promiscuity that causes us to not be thinking clearly, that we're thinking with a sexually charged motivation instead of the rational thinking that we ought to be having. Now, let's pause here for just a moment. Does this mean that we cannot become aroused by our wife for men who are married, or by a husband for women who are married? Absolutely not. We're talking about illicit sexual gratification outside of the marriage bed, as it has been ordained by God from all the way back in Genesis chapter 2. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is this illicit sexual gratification, the illicit sexual encounters with someone who is not our spouse. It opens a can of worms, and we see here that it cost John the Baptist his life. That, combined with being drunken and being in front of people, falling into peer pressure, and a whole host of other things that went into this. The lessons we can learn from this is to behave ourselves and stay away from that which is immoral, ungodly, and unethical. Now we move on in the text to Mark chapter 6, verses 30 to 32. We come down here and we read, "Then the apostles gathered to Jesus and told him all things, both what they had done and what they had taught. And he said to them, 'Come aside by yourselves to a deserted place and rest a while.' For there were many come and going, and they did not even have time to eat. So they departed to a deserted place in the boat by themselves." Think about this. The 12 return to Jesus, and they regroup. More than likely, they did this in Capernaum because this is typically where Jesus concluded all his ministry at, when he would go out and he'd be teaching. He'd come back to Capernaum, where he would have like his home base, where he could regroup and try to get his thoughts together and to head out on his next leg of his ministry from. Well, during this time, the apostles reported all they had done and all they had taught. And when we read this, think about this. This debriefing was crucial to their training. They needed to talk about what they had done, what they had not done, what was effective, what was not effective, how people had reacted, how people had not reacted. And they needed to get there. They needed this. Why? Because they still had Jesus with them, so he could help to answer the questions and help them to see where they could be more effective in their ministry, to maximize how they operated and to be of maximum efficiency once he had ascended back to the Father on high, which is still in the future from where we're at here in the text. But think about this. In the text here, it says they were again thrown by crowds, and there were so many coming and going, they didn't even have a chance to eat. And we've seen this before, that everything is so busy surrounding Jesus, they don't have time to eat. Sometimes not even really time to sleep. No time to themselves to regroup, recharge. And if they don't have time to eat, they more than likely didn't have time that had time to even talk about their mission tours, if you will, going out and they're about their where they had been and what they had done. But in the midst of all this, the disturbing news about John the Baptist came to them. And at this point, Jesus and the 12 retreated to a secluded place. Well, think about this. When Jesus and the 12 they retreat to a secluded place. This removed Jesus and his disciples from Herod's territory. Now, this doesn't mean he would never return to Galilee. Jesus would return to Galilee from time to time, though the bulk of his work in that province was complete. And this should have given Jesus some needed alone time with his disciples. So, giving this alone time with his disciples, they had just finished an arduous journey. Think about it, they went out two by two. And this wasn't like, an extended period of time where they could have time to work. This was a short-lived mission journey, if you will. As we've talked about in previous lessons, this would have only lasted a couple weeks or so, but it was very intense. And anyone who has been out and been in a very intense campaign or any type of work, your body at the end of it, especially think about this during this day and time when we're talking about, they walked. They didn't have a car they could jump into and zip down the road, or airplanes they could ride, or trains or whatever. Everything was done by walking. Occasionally they would have, they may have had animals to travel on, but they walked. So their bodies have been crying out for rest. And when, we see that. But it was just not to be. They were still thronged by these crowds. People were still coming around them. And they needed to remove themselves and be in a secluded place so that they could regroup, they could recharge, and be ready to go out and continue the ministry that so greatly needed to be done. So as we come down here to the conclusion of lesson number 45, Jesus' time in Galilee was basically complete after this tour. Though he would go back time to time, he did not spend significant time again in this region. Just to recap, when we look at the beginning of this lesson, John the Baptist is put to death. Why? When we go back and look at the lesson, why was he put to death? Because he had spoken out against immorality and ungodliness. And even though Herod had murdered John the Baptist, he's now taking note of Jesus. And the timing of this is now coinciding with Jesus ending his tours in Galilee, which proved to be beneficial because it's still not time for Jesus to come in contact with civil authorities in the aspect of being arrested or questioned. Encourage you to continue this, following along with us through this study of the life of Christ. We'll be continuing through this. If you have questions or would like a copy of the outline or like to know how to attain the commentary, feel free to send us an email at info@ccocwv.org. We'll do what we can to help you out. Until next time, God bless.